Hello and welcome to the next of our lecture recaps. This is a recap of our lecture on ethics. So the thing that we're looking at here is the ethical principles that we have in our ethical code as accountants. So remember, they are principles, not rules, and there were 5 of them, and you need to learn all 5. So the first one was integrity, and the key words with integrity are that you must act in a straightforward and honest way. Objectivity, remember, this meant that there should be no bias, there should be no conflict of interest, and there should be no undue influence on you as a professional accountant. Professional competence and due care, this related to working with diligence and undertaking continuing professional development once you're qualified. And then confidentiality, we must retain confidentiality of client data, and that is unless we have a professional duty to reveal it. For example, money laundering regulations would be a reason to reveal that information, or indeed it's in the public interest to reveal it. For example, a fraud in a public organisation. Lastly then, we have professional behaviour, and that's not to do anything that could bring the profession into disrepute. So you need to learn all 5 of those objectives and make sure that you know them. You also need to learn the ethical threats. And the ethical threats were self-review, so that's reviewing your own work. For example, if you were an auditor and you also did the tax work for a client, well, you would be reviewing that tax work during the audit. Familiarity, becoming too familiar with the client, again, that is going to be an ethical threat. Advocacy, this is a tricky one. This is speaking on behalf or being an advocate for a client, and that's particularly as an auditor. Intimidation, again, that's being forced to do something maybe through fees, or indeed if you were working inside a firm as an accountant, maybe taking an inducement to do something. And self-interest, that is going to be having shares in a client, for example, if you were an auditor, and that would be a self-interest threat. Again, inducements would be an example of a self-interest threat in if you were working as an accountant in industry. Okay, so some safeguards that there are in place are by the profession. First of all, we have our entry exams so that we're aware of all of these ethical codes. We also have our continuing professional development to ensure we're always aware throughout our careers of them. Corporate governance codes also make sure that we act in an ethical way, and we have our standards, our ISAs and our IAS to make sure that we apply ethical rules. In work, you may also have some standards. For example, the employer might have a code of conduct which relates to ethics, and they'll have internal controls to try to make sure that things are done in an ethical way. Remember, for the individual, you need to continue your continuing professional development and keep up to date with those developments. So, in an exam, how are you going to resolve ethical issues? Well, the first thing to do is to gather the facts. So you gather the facts and establish what ethical issues there are. So refer to the fundamental principles and see if there could be a potential breach of those principles. See if there are any internal procedures that you're supposed to follow, and do that first of all. Set out the alternative courses of action and then consult within the firm or indeed get legal advice to try and decide what to do. In a situation like this, as an accountant, you may be forced to withdraw, you may not be able to carry out work, or you may not be able to work in that particular organisation. So we're going to look in more detail later on in the course at how we have some models for actually resolving ethical threats. We'll be looking later on in the module at some areas and some models for actually dealing with ethical behaviour and looking at how a firm should respond to different ethical situations. But let's just look at how the individual might manage some of those ethical threats. For example, a conflict of interest. So if you've got a conflict between your employer and the code that we've just looked at, for example, taking an illegal action, so maybe the employer wants you to take action that you know to be illegal, well, the safeguards that you would need to put in place here would be to discuss the action with the ACCA, to take legal advice, and then potentially to withdraw. If you had a lack of knowledge, well, you know that you must act honestly. So if you're acting honestly, that means that you would need to take training, undertake continuing professional development to make sure that you attained that knowledge. You could also ask for assistance, so tell the people within your firm that you're not able to do the work and look for some assistance to do it. There could be pressure, so pressure, for example, to undertake false reporting, and that again could come from your employer. So some of the safeguards you could have would be whistleblowing, maybe to the audit committee as we've discussed. Also, we could discuss this with the ACCA to get their views on what you should actually do. When it comes to inducements, so gifts or hospitality, well, the main safeguard here is not to accept it. You could take legal advice if you were offered an inducement or something like that. With confidentiality, remember you always maintain confidentiality except where there's a legal requirement to reveal the information, for example, for money laundering, drug trafficking, that sort of thing, or if it's in the public interest, so maybe a fraud in a public organisation. Indeed, also, if you're given permission to reveal the information, well then that's fine as well. So we looked at some of these in illustration 1. That then was our recap of our lecture on ethics.